really are so many disparate descriptors that can be used to illustrate this song at different points throughout. Like dark, ethereal, futuristic, primordial, murky, clear, industrial, and uplifting. And yet, for me, they all work, even though that on paper they seem to contradict one another or to be the antithesis of the other. Hey, everybody out there. Welcome back to another episode of the Audiophiles. Andy and John here to discuss some music. And John over there, the man with the hand gestures, is going to be offering up something for me to go off and listen to. I'll do just that. I'm familiar with that one. And then we will come back and discuss it further in detail. But in order to get started here, John, what are we working with today, my friend?
So the band is called Vessels.
Okay.
No, me neither. And the track is called Monoform.
Monoform.
Yes, well, you have to paperwork you have to fill out when you have to get a single eyebrow.
So let me go off and give this thing a listen.
Sorry.
Yeah. Apology accepted. And I will come back and let you know what I've made of it. Drums are amazing. These drums are so intense and awesome. I mean, they are. I love a lot of what's going on here. I love honestly everything that's going on here, but the drums to me stand out, comparatively speaking, sort of head and shoulders above the rest. There are these really interesting synthy key bits and all kinds of interesting sounds that are injected into this, but the pace of this whole track has been set by these incredible drums that are going on. Yeah, I'm loving this. I think this is the first bit of any sort of vocalizing I've heard throughout it, and it actually fits in just like another layer of music into this large tapestry that they've woven here. It obviously I don't think we're gonna get any lyrics, or at least during this portion, where it just sounds like oohs and ahs kind of vocalizing and adding more dimension to the track. But yeah, this sounds fabulous. It's interesting. Even that hi-hat work. Great. Deep. Ooh. Fucking drums. Wow. 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 That was fully and deeply immersive, everything about this track. But I think you'd be hard pressed not to underscore how powerful and important those drums were throughout this entire track. I mean, there are all kinds of interesting machinations and sounds and fades and the use of both cans and how it creates that feeling of that immersive feeling. But the drums uh really won me over, really from the moment go all the way through. It just got, and that just that cacophony of sound there toward the latter portion where everything just kind of came to a head and exploded was almost overwhelming. But in such a good way. Like it was just, I found it really hard to stop often in this, and which is probably good news to some of you out there who I know hate the stops and starts. But it's important to kind of like in real time get our reactions and feelings out there as we're going to discuss the song in further detail on the other side when we get back to John. But this song had all these different and disparate. It provided all these different and disparate feelings. Some that even don't quite make sense. I mean, there were parts of this that sounded futuristic. There were other parts of it that sounded primordial. A lot of that came from this almost like robotic tribal kind of dynamic that was happening with the percussions, as well as a lot of the other sounds that were happening in the background. At points, it sounded really dark, but then at other points, it sounded almost ethereal or like some, like it was like steampunk angelic. It was just really, really interesting. At points, there was clarity, but there was also points where there was like this murky nature to it, and it all kind of worked together to create this musical undertow that was turning and tossing me around as it unfolded. I really really enjoyed this track. Um, yeah, it's just funny how almost always when John gives me a track that is pretty much without any vocals, um, how much it just washes over me. This is another classic example of that. I really loved the musical trip it took me on. And I'm sitting here describing how I'm feeling, and for the first time, really focusing on the thumbnail because the music was just absolutely captivating. But there is this interesting dynamic how, like, you have this sort of pastoral depiction on one side and then this industrial depiction on the other. And that odd juxtaposition and dynamic between two disparate and different things is how I started describing the song, dark and light and futuristic and primordial and all these like very opposing descriptors, and yet here is this picture that kind of sums it up in a way, which is really odd. And it's coincidental that I'm now looking at this and feeling like it through art depicts this song so well. The different angles that this song comes from at different points throughout it, and sometimes even meshes them together to create just a dynamic, interesting approach and overall sound with the finished product that I just peeped out here. Yeah, this was fabulous. Really, really good stuff. I can't wait to kind of dig in more and learn more about Vessels. I've never heard of them before, but having just heard them, I'm already really, really interested. So let's get back to John and learn more because my interest is fully piqued at this point.
Montana, he's back. So you've had a perusal through Monoform by Vessels. Um, Tell us all about it.
It's quite an experience, man. I really thoroughly enjoyed it as well. The song begins with what sounds like what you would hear if you placed a stethoscope on the chest of a robot. It was this like metronomic pulsating 1 2 1 2 1 2 sort of motif, and has somewhat of a cold, calculated feeling to it. But within about 12 seconds or so, it's joined by a loose and somewhat dampened but upbeat drums that gives the track its pace and its movement. And then in comes this synthy and fuzzed out do flourish that kind of stumbles into the track and then provides this lower resonance. And it repeats that aforementioned flourish and resonance as the song continues to take shape. Then we get this quickened like 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 motif, and as the energy of the drums increases in pace, and there is something trance-inducing about the movement of the song at this point. It kind of pulls you into this electronic whirlpool, um, and the drums are really standing out and adding bits of flair with all these manic rolls on the snare as the song slightly changes around the, I guess it's like sort of the 118 mark, with these added bits of higher key work that resonate over the soundscape. And deeper in the mix, you hear these almost chime like or xylophone esque higher register plunkings. The continued flourishes by the drummer really stand out and give this hurried, shuffled pace to the song. Um, and for all the interesting bells and whistles they are adding to this track, those drums remain the constant, and for me are the star of the track, at least thus far. Um, and by the 210 mark, I catch what I believe is the first bit of vocalizing. It's not even forward. It's just this kind of added distant layer of like music that's added to the track, and it's enjoyable to hear. It's clearly isn't integral to the operation, but it does provide like again this layer of music that is you can appreciate it for what it is, but we're clearly not going to get a narrative or any exposition from it. You know what I mean? Um, then around the 237 mark, the music falls back after another doodle doo on that like fuzzed out synthy instrument that is acting almost like the a bass line for the track. Its final note resonates and fades, and the drums focus on this metallic hi-hat motif for a bit as these higher but murky notes noodle about for a bit. And this is capped off by more fuzzed out descending notes that hit that 1 2 3 4. And on the fifth note, the beat drops back in as the drums shift their focus from solely the hi-hats to fuller sounding beats from earlier. And the drum work beneath this canvas of sound, made up of this electronic key and synth work, is like a hazy blanket of electronic humidity lingering thick in the air. This higher registered sort of tinkling. You're going to get a lot of weird noises that I'm making to try to replicate all these interesting electronic sounds. It comes more into focus at this point, almost fluttering about like the wings of an electronic butterfly. Um, and then we get another descending 1 2 3 4 5, and again on that fifth, the cymbal crashes and resonates as the drums completely cut out, leaving a faint, higher registered pulse and this cold, almost menacing, fuzzed out whirring. Um, but you can soon feel them tease at the beginning of a buildup. This faint and higher sound starts emerging from the distance and coming more into focus like a ray of sunshine piercing through, piercing and slowly expanding through this thick wall of black clouds. And the drums rejoin with a ticka 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 on the hi hat. Soon thereafter, the drums also begin peppering in this interesting tom work yet to be heard in the track. And I can only describe the sound at this point to being like techno tribal. It has an interesting balance of sounds, both futuristic and primordial, which is I mean, there's a weird dynamic in this song constantly between two juxtaposed and different sounds that somehow find their way in the same track, and that's outside of just the stellar drum work, one of the most interesting things about the song in general, and I'm going to touch on that when I get to the end of my notes. With a tight splash, the drums cut out at the 5/16 mark, and quickly approaching in the distance comes what sounds like to me this wall of torrential downpour that cascades over the emptiness of the track for just a moment before everything kicks off by the 5:21 mark. And this to me is the climax of the track. This explosion of sound emerging from near nothingness. I absolutely loved it. Um, and you could feel it percolating and like simmering to a and coming up to a boil slow like throughout the whole track, and finally we get the payoff. And the drums are so energetic as um during this portion that they fire off, and they're coupled with these ethereal sounds like electronic angels and higher registered and frictious sounding kind of like wailing guitar work. At least that's what it sounded like to me in the moment. At around the 6:15 marker, the cacophony subsides like a passing storm, and we're left with shuffling drums and this almost droning, lower warbling sound of resonant distortion that slowly dies down to silence at the end of the track. And this song is deeply immersive and really pulled me in like an aggressive undertow. There were layers and constantly shifting movements and motion throughout it that kept me fully invested throughout the nearly 7 minutes of music. I really enjoyed the whole thing, but to me, there is little argument to be had over how outstanding the drums were throughout this piece. I mean, the amount of wrist strength and stamina that is required for all the different bits and pieces of the drum work throughout this is really outstanding. And really are so many disparate descriptors that can be used to illustrate this song at different points throughout. Like dark, ethereal, futuristic, primordial, murky, clear, industrial, and uplifting. And yet for me, they all work, even though that on paper they seem to contradict one another or to be the antithesis of the other. And I really enjoyed this. I have to say that, like, the nature of the music in my experience listening to it was such that I paused it very infrequently, maybe just a couple times. And I kind of just let it wash over me, and I didn't even focus that much on the screen saved to observe timestamps to make sure I got my pause game strong. But it wasn't until after it got done and I was thinking and looking at the screen that I realized the cover art of the album itself is kind of a illustration of what I just have been saying about this dichotomy of two very disparate different things. You have this sort of pastoral farm land on one side that bleeds into this industrial, polluted, probably overpopulated area, hardly sparse in vast acreage. You know, it's all filled with concrete and buildings and all this stuff, and it's really a great way of depicting how two very different things can exist side by side in an odd way that somehow works out. And this song was that. As I went through all these contradictory descriptors that were still applicable, here I'm looking at a depiction of two contradictory, antithetical landscapes butting up against one another. That was the visual. That was a great visual to describe sort of the feeling and the sound of this song. So yeah, I really really enjoyed this track a lot, and it's like, you know, another example of a we'll call it instrumental that you've given me, where I'm just like, it's so much more immersive on a first listen to just let music wash over you and not um have to pick up on narratives and you know, exposition and all that stuff. Now I'm a lyrical nut job. I think we both know that at this point. I love going through lyrics and picking through metaphors and similes and all that stuff. But every once in a while, man, to just let a song hit you like a wave and then kind of recede, and in the case of this one, hit you a couple more times, uh, is cool. It's a great listening experience, and it kind of is. It's less of an assignment, though this is an assignment I'll continue to sign up for and enjoy doing when we get into these songs that have interesting narratives to them. And it's more of just a true organic experience. So yeah, I really loved this track a lot, John. Great show.
Fantastic, fantastic. Yeah, interesting. A few points you mentioned. Um, yeah, it's really okay. The reason I picked this is a familiar tale, which I've said a few times. It has all worked out pretty well each time I've said this, but going through the vault, I found a folder with an album that I seem to have had for a number of years and not listened to, and it's this. And I must have reformatted one of my exterior hard drives um, way back, so everything's the earliest date is 2018, but it may have been before then. But I've had it since at least 2018. I only started listening to this album about 6 months ago. I'm very much the same as you. I put it on. First track is this. This is the opening track,
Oh wow.
and
Well, it's a
and
good
it was
opening track. Is it
it really
correct?
is because, like you say, it washes over you. It's an organic experience, and those fucking drums, and those three things, just like, yeah, this is great. Wax it on. Listen to it a few more times the album way through, and I have to say, I struggled to pick which track to give you because I could have given you all nine, honestly. And it's one of the few albums where you really benefit from listening to the whole thing. It just goes into one as a whole piece. It's great. It's not a concept. Well, I guess perhaps it is, but um, it's got a sound to it, an overall sound to it. But there's some little elements and some great songs. So I'll probably grab another song or two for you. Actually, this is an instrumental. That those sort of vocalizing you heard was synthetic.
Oh,
Um,
okay, okay.
yeah, but
Because they
it
had
just
this
I know
like
what you mean. Yes,
quality to it
yes.
that sounded like it came from a
Yeah,
mouth.
yeah, definitely. And I think that was the idea behind it.
Yeah.
But out of the nine tracks on this album, only four of them have vocals.
Oh
Uh,
wow. Wow. Okay.
and one of those is a guest vocal from another artist um, who does a fantastic impersonation of Tom York, I have to say.
Okay.
And you might be getting that. But anyway,
And
so yeah,
to be fair, probably a good person to try to depict over music and soundscapes such as because it screams it could have some Radiohead like vocals over top of it for
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so a really interesting band as well. I don't know there's not a lot out there about them. I've cobbled together what I can. So Vessels are an English band. They're from Leeds, Yorkshire,
Mhm.
and they formed in 2005.
Okay.
The band started off as a post-rock outfit for their first two albums. This is their second album, Helioscope. But they later then evolved after those two albums into a techno electronic dance outfit. With notably the release of their third album, Delate, which I haven't listened to. I've only really listened to this album. I've got the first album digitally, but I haven't, explored it. I've really immersed myself in this one. So um, I could understand and perhaps see after this them going towards a sort of techno thing. I don't think it's a huge leap, to be fair,
No.
in terms of the elements they're doing. From what I understand, the first album is pretty much all guitars. This album, you heard, has got those electronic touches in it, and then from there they start to abandon the guitars and go completely electronic sound. Anyway, personnel: Tom Evans, electronics, vocals; Tim Mitchell, drums; Martin Teff, guitar, bass, synth; Lee J. Malcolm, electronics, synth, drums; and Peter Wright, electronics. So in 2007, the band released their debut single. And after that, on the strength of that, they were tipped by BBC Radio 1 as one of the hottest new bands in the country. They brought out their debut album, White Fields and Open Devices, in 2008. This track, as I said, is the opener from their second album, Helioscope, released in February 2011. In June of that year, Vessels headlined the BBC introducing stage at the Glastonbury Festival. So they're on track, in terms of getting in with BBC at the very least. The artwork and the thumbnail you mentioned is really wonderful. This is a gatefold album, and it's got illustrations of constellations on the inside of it and the sort of workings. And it's this kind of really interesting steampunk mixed in with like H.G. Wells and other stuff to sort
It,
of.
it's so weird that you just use the word steampunk because I think I described the music as having a steampunk quality to it in my reaction, which is completely unplanned and uncoordinated by you and I here, but here's a very niche descriptor that we both ended up using without
Yeah,
knowing
yeah, exactly.
enormously.
You get the sort of like steampunk Victoriana, which people do the cosplay and all that sort
Yeah,
of stuff.
yeah.
It's not quite that, but it's more like you said, this mixture of this pastoral and this other stuff. So that's why I sort of threw in H.G. Wells or that sort of thing.
Mhm.
But yeah, so the artwork is done by Luke Droizd, Drozd. Great stuff. The lead single from this album is called Meat Man, Piano Tuner Prostitute. Catchy title. And it featured Stuart Warwick, who used to be a singer in a band called Jacob's Story on vocals. And he's the aforementioned guy who does a great turn, very much like Mr. York. So, got some write-ups here to help us flesh out this. Drowned in Sound gave this album 8 out of 10. Um, and they did a big write-up, part of which they say Monoform, which begins suspiciously like Balloons by Foals. Don't know it, but I'll take their word for it. Before spiraling into its own world entirely. It's headed up by chunky, distorted synth, egging on the opening skittering pace and fluttering and oscillating throughout. It soon morphs into pulsating waves of grandiose and uncompromisingly atmospheric sonic layers. Within the latter minutes of this 6-minute epic, pinning down the dual feelings of mountaintop desolation and the stunning, often destructive power of nature. Helioscope is another example of Vessel's growing ability to map out enormously ambitious journeys that go beyond the obvious touchstones and influences. In short, definitely worthy of your attention. And in the separate article, they actually had the band sort of walk them through track by track the album. And here's what they sort of, the write-up was, what they said about Monoform. In quotes, this started a mere 2 weeks before we set off for Dallas to record the album. Martin was adamant that none of the tunes we had were appropriate album openers, so we were set the inevitable task of pulling out a killer tune out of our ass within a fortnight. Once we got the first groove and analog bass line down, it pretty much wrote itself, though. It's the only full band piece on the album that was not recorded totally live, as we didn't have time to learn it all well enough. So we did it a section at a time. It features a cheeky vibraphone solo, which was a last minute addition. Right up from our friends Pitchfork, bass soloing on the first few minutes of Monoform. Vessels would seem like another perfectly okay instrumental rock group. The arpeggiating synth and nimble, insistent drumming bring to mind recent Maserati or older Trans Am, and the switch of focus from their heavy bass tones to a rolling xylophone in the second verse is a nice twist. As the song progresses, however, it becomes clear that Vessels are more interested in taking a road less travelled, opting to eschew the expected crescendo for some scenic meandering. It's only after mucking around for about 3 minutes, including a minute-long segue into what seems like a different song altogether, that they decide to pump up the volume and blow the speakers out. Delaying the presumably inevitable climax allows that pro forma soft to loud move to actually surprise, which is an achievement in itself. Even when Helioscope offers a more traditionally post-rock track, Vessels away with arrangements and sonics produce something refreshingly out of the ordinary. The quietus, Tim Mitchell's drumming has been ushered further into the limelight. His dexterous patterns now far more chief catalyst than mere backbone, positively dragging opening pair of tracks, Monoform and The Trap. Yeah, it's even more drum forwards. Through their bars with controlled time signature fluctuating ruthlessness. An album that acts as a shot in the arm to guitar-based instrumental music, an album of life and charm, one that's not afraid to put the human voice in amongst its array of oral dexterities, and one that is capable of subtle majesty at one point and brutal velocity at another. And there's a nice little bit here from BBC Music, who clearly like Vessels. They put, devised in the early 17th century, a helioscope allowed whoever was using it to stare indirectly right at the sun by projecting an image of it through a telescope onto a white piece of paper suspended in a dark room. Some 300 years later, Leeds-based five-piece vessels have created their very own oral version. Except with this second album, it feels less like looking at an image of the sun and more like staring directly into it.
Mm.
Beginning with the tumbling intensity of Monoform, Heloscope is an album that pummels your senses, fills your head and your mind with its insistent polyrhythms and incessant restlessness. An immense, intense album. So, continuing the story, they released their third album, Delayed, in 2015. This record saw the band moving away, in quotes, from the overt post-rock foundations of second album, Heloscope, and into a more electronic sound. The music from Delay is less guitar-oriented and is instead based heavily on synthesizers and percussion, leading to danceable dynamics that resonate with focused heft and power. Metacritic gave the album a score of 77 out of 100. And then their last album, The Great Distraction, was released in 2017 and featured several guest vocalists, including John Grant and Wayne Coyne of the Flaming Lips. This album marks a further evolution for the group, who have steadily pushed the boundaries of their post-rock foundations, with each of their studio albums edging further into electronica territory. As I said, I've not explored that any of their other albums, actually, the more guitar ones or the electronic ones, which I will do at some point, but I'm fully besotted with this one at the moment. So,
Mhm.
this will do for the time being. You talked about the sort of the imagery and how bits of this track were kind of like sci-fi and other bits were primordial. I have it in my head that this is almost like a soundtrack to a time-lapse film of some force geoforming a planet.
Mm.
Um, you can imagine there's sort of like you've got this picture then of sci-fi nature. They're forming the sort of, the trees and the mountains and the oceans, which is all natural, but they're doing it with, whatever they're using in a sci-fi way. And I just get these images of these, you know, waves being formed and these mountains appearing and all that sort of stuff. And it just, that pops into my head when I listen to it. So, yeah. So it fits completely with what you're saying,
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there you
And
go.
I'll tell you what else is interesting is and kind of refreshing and makes me all that much more interested to hear more off this album is the critique you read, really a glowing one of the album itself, could easily be cut and paste to describe this track. So if this track is a microcosm of the entirety of the album on which it features, then to me, having enjoyed it so much, that's a huge indicator that this is just a really good album of which I would enjoy all. So it's like I can't wait. I mean, that's a ringing endorsement in my mind because like if I enjoyed this track so much and from it I extrapolated a lot of what this author said of the entirety of the album, then chances are I'm really going to enjoy the whole kit and caboodle. So I look forward to hearing more from these guys, not just based off this one track, but of this write up that goes hand in glove with my experience listening just to the opening track.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, there's the same experience I had listening to it. I was like, wow,
Yeah,
this is a bit of a find. It really is.
yeah, yeah,
Because it was refreshing to hear this as a slightly different take. It's got similarities to things like Maserati and other stuff, but with other things as well, which
yeah.
is what
Yeah,
all songs
exactly.
are really.
It's I mean, you hear this, it's cooler at this juncture, and this is to take nothing away to what I'm about to compare it to because I like that for what it is, but it's cooler to hear, oh, there's a band that sounds like Maserati because there aren't a whole lot of those when you compare it to, oh, this is a band that sounds a lot like Foo Fighters. It's like, yeah, but there's a lot of bands that sound like them by now. You know what I mean? So I don't know if I'm really, chomping at the bit to hear another, version of that. Whereas with a more niche sound that is sort of this post rock, but with flirtations in industrial and techno and things like that, maybe I won't like it upon that description, but at least it's intriguing. And then to hear it and like it is like, okay, there might be a couple other acts out here that are doing similar things, but there isn't like this sea of other acts that are doing this. You know what I mean? So it's still
Yeah,
refreshing in that regard.
and I think honestly, it got a decent reception from the critics, but not overwhelming. But I think, this, as I say, came out in 2011. Let me just double check. Yeah, if it came out 10 years later, the appetite for post rock stuff then, Squid, etc., was much greater. So if
Yeah.
this had come out 10 years later, probably people would have falling over themselves without this album. But there you
Yeah,
go. It's
yeah.
about timing, isn't it? A lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. Right, I shall wrap things up. So thank you for listening to this, Andy.
Thank you.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Folks out there, tell us what you think. Are you familiar with Vessels, the band? This album or track, or any of their other stuff? Please, as I said, I've not listened to anything apart from this particular album. So if you have knowledge, share it with the group and tell us what you think. If you have encountered their other albums, I'd be very interested to hear what you think. So please hit the like button if you like this, drop some comments, subscribe, it makes sense and all that business. Thanks so much for subscribing. Really appreciate everybody who does support the channel. That being said, thanks again so much for watching. I will see all of you next episode of the Audiophiles.
See you later, guys.